right, good morning. Welcome, friends, to ZenGlop, the podcast. Music, poetry, psychogeography. Today, sort of in line with the meditation notes, more sort of philosophy rather than meditation. And in fact, I think that we'll end up with a bit of history about the word ZenGlop, what it means, what it could mean, what it has meant, what it might mean. All of that coming up this episode in the next few minutes. So before we do that, go to zenglop.net and check out the podcast archives. Subscribe to the podcast if you're checking this out on YouTube. Good morning. And subscribe to the channel. If you're checking this out on iTunes or Google Play, subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. So, yes, zenglop.net, your repository for all things ZenGlopian. So I was prompted to this context, to this concept, to this question. I was listening to a lecture on pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. And so one of my goals for the year, for 2021, is to read through the complete dialogues, the Platonic dialogues, which represent the Socratic wisdom, right? Plato writes these short stories, really these narratives that are set as dialogues between someone, not Plato, and Socrates. So I've read, a few years ago I read The Republic in some detail, and then I've read the Socratic Apology and the Phaedo, which are the dialogues that deal with Socrates, his trial and his death. I'd read those a few years ago as well, and then just reread them. The collection I have starts with those. So, all right, so I've got Socrates on my mind as a role model and an exemplar. What would Socrates do is a question that I've taken as a motto for the year, also as just that prompt to think, well, what's an alternative way of examining this situation? Or is there a different way that I can react to the person in front of me or to the phenomena that is occurring? But, beyond that, I don't know a whole lot about Greek philosophy. And, I've never studied it. So I thought I would just poke around a bit, lectures on YouTube and audiobooks and whatnot, and see what I could do to further my own, that gap in my education. And so I came across this set of lectures, I think from the Great Courses, and it's very engaging. It's an overview of Greek philosophy. It's broken out into the pre-Socratics, right? Philosophers before Socrates, and then Plato, Aristotle. So sort of Socrates is the linchpin, the watershed, and I think that's fair. So pre-Socratic would be before the 5th century BC, so maybe the 6th century BC. And some of the names were familiar. Heraclitus is considered a pre-Socratic. I'm familiar with that name, partly because Heidegger wrote an essay on Heraclitus, but also because I'm actually quite drawn to the idea that we only have fragments of Heraclitus. We only have fragments of all the pre-Socratics. And that's appealing to me as an aesthetic. Like I would compose music that is fragmentary. Oh, I just realized I don't have my headsets on. So I can't hear myself. Hopefully this is recording correctly. Anyway, so the pre-Socratics, we don't know a whole lot about them. We don't have a lot of their documentation. But we do know where they came from, and we know roughly when they lived. And we know the kinds of things that they were interested in because the bits that survive suggest there were a few common threads. Now maybe that's just, we think that because that's all we have remaining. Perhaps they spent most of their time talking about beer recipes, but they didn't save those. And so, for example, we think that the philosophers from Miletus were primarily concerned with a definable source for all being. Because maybe that's the only bit that survived, and maybe that's because nobody ever read it, and it was off in a corner somewhere, and all they did was read their beer recipes, and so those got broken and stained, thrown away. But let's suppose that it's fair to say that in Miletus, in the 6th century BC, there was a series of philosophers who probably knew each other, I think, I gathered from the lecture, may have studied with each other, but certainly can be seen as a development, as a series of 3 philosophers. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. I do have those written down in front of me. I have not been able to memorize Anaximander and Anaximenes. But they're good names, and maybe if I were ever to get a new cat or a dog, I would call it Anaximander. It's a good name. Anaximander, come here. Sit, Anaximander. So the progression of the thought there is, what is the discrete object, the source from which all others come from? And the progression in thought seems to evolve around whether that is a single determinate substance, and if so, what is it? Or is it an indeterminate substance? And so, for example, Thales thought that everything that we see, everything that has become, came from water. Fair enough, right? And then Anaximander found the question interesting and suitable, but came up with a different answer and said, no, everything comes from air. But there's still the idea that there's a definite substance that in some way or another forms the basis for everything else. Anaximenes, the third of the 3 Miletian philosophers, the philosophers from Miletus, thought that while it makes sense that there is something from which things come from, that thing could not be a thing in itself, because if it were, it would be a thing and not able to turn into other things. And so he proposed a sort of indefinite substance. And that's where it triggered something with me. So this source of all, whether it's indefinite or definite, the Miletians called the Archae, or the Archon. It's a great word. There's got to be a limerick in here somewhere, right? There once were 3 philosophers from Miletus. There once were 3 Miletian philosophers who thought about. Think about a limerick. Think about how to write a limerick about the philosophers of Miletus. It's a great title, even if it's not a limerick. It's a great title. So the Archon, the Miletian Archon, is the source of everything. There's all kinds of problems with that, right? Like, it's the question that has driven philosophy since then. pretty fucking amazing, right? Same question in 6th century BC in Miletus, which, if I look at the map here, is in, I know it's in Turkey because they say that, and I'm not sure that I would have identified that just looking at the map, but it's on the other side of the ocean from Greece, the other side of the Aegean. Probably right where Troy is, somewhere around there. Isn't that where Troy is? So, Anatolia, on the western coast of Anatolia. That's what Wikipedia tells me. But there is a question here, right? There is something here that has to come from somewhere, right? It's the same question that the Buddhists ask. What is the... and the answer, the Buddhist answer, is that there is really no permanent substance, whether it's definite or indefinite. There's nothing permanent underneath it. It's a different answer, but it's the same question. Now, I've gone on a bit longer than I meant to on this. I'm 11 minutes in, so let me just quickly kind of wrap this up, right? When I talk about ZenGlop, I am inching towards the same question. And that word, ZenGlop, is something that is silly, right? It's a dumb word. Glop. ZenGlop. I've been criticized for using that word. I've been criticized as trivializing the work that I'm doing by using that term. Fair enough. I started to use that word after there was a moment, right? I was listening to a record by a band called The Shaman, and they had an album called, was it Big Boss Drum, something like that? Anyway, there's a track at the end of that album called Re-Evolution, and it's a rave dance, rave thing, with audio recording of Terence McKenna talking about this object, and he describes it as an object glittering in hyperspace, spinning in hyperspace, sending out like sort of shooting off like the plasma from the sun, sort of shooting off this substance that would go back and forward in time, because it's in hyperspace, it's outside of time. It's when time has ended, not because time has stopped, but because time is no longer a relevant concept. And he says, illuminating this mystic, that visionary, pulling everything towards this singularity outside of time. And I was very impressed with that, and I can continue to be very impressed with that. And my answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, or what is a determinate element of that, would start with something like that. And perhaps everything that I do, struggling towards comprehension, whether it's meditation practice or composition or these podcasts, perhaps everything that I'm doing is to increase my capacity to experience that ZenGlop. Anyway, good for now. Thank you for listening this far, and keep your wits about you. I'll check in with you tomorrow.